Okay. All right. Pull up the notes I sent out this morning. We're gonna finish up the chapter. How do you like them apples?
It's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. You can feel the electricity in there. I get it. So, and again, tomorrow we'll review. All right. We'll play the Kahoot game. All right. And maybe we could play it on the screen there where we can get the Kahoot music.
All right.
All right.
That's all I've been waiting for.
What's that?
That's all I needed.
Yeah. So, I don't want to like exclude those at home though. That's the problem. I'll have to figure something out. Maybe I'll just record the Kahoot music and do a remix or something. All right. So yesterday we were talking about the Byzantine Empire. And again, when I say we, strictly me, you trying to pay attention, but I want to include you in the experience. All right. So we were talking about the Byzantine Empire, which is like just a fancy name for the Eastern Roman Empire, right? When we're talking about how like Rome fell in like 476, the Eastern half continued on. The very last slide that I was kind of pushing through because I got kind of like this jibber jabberish was something called the East-West Schism. Have you ever heard the term schism before? It's one of these fancy words. You can add it to your vocabulary repertoire. It means basically a division, a split within an organization, usually religious in nature. All right. We'll talk about one they call it the Great Schism. That's at one point next chapter. There's two popes. There's one in Rome and there's one in Avignon, France. All right. The East-West Schism, though, is the one in 1054, where in the Christian world, it was kind of divided like how the Roman Empire was divided. Who's the real leader of the Christian world? Those in Western Europe, places like France and places like England and the Holy Roman Empire, tended to look to the Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope. Right? Those in places like Greece and Constantinople tended to look to the Patriarch of Constantinople, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So it wasn't really clear there, like who was, and so there was this kind of like division. 1054, basically the Eastern Orthodox Church basically establishes itself as separate from the Catholic Church. Right? There was an issue with kind of use of icons and stuff like that. So that we start to see kind of Europe kind of divide between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. That was 1054. All right. So fast forward about 20 years or so, we start to see the kind of foundations for what we refer to as the Crusades kind of established. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a short little video. It's only 2 minutes long, so don't fall asleep. You're just hurting yourself because if you start engaging REM sleep, then you're going to have to wake up because you're going to want to get this information. Now, when I start lecturing and you want to fall asleep, then you got plenty of opportunity for REM sleep because I could basically just kind of like talk all the time and you basically fall asleep. But I would highly recommend you just kind of stay awake from this.
In the late 11th century, Muslim sultans ruled most of North Africa, Spain, and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. The Christian world is split. Europe is a collection of small states and kingdoms. To the east, the Byzantine Empire is controlled from its capital in Constantinople, what would later become Istanbul in Turkey.
The Crusades give us a model, they give us a template of the clash of religions and the clash of civilizations and the clash of continents.
In the Middle East, Acre is a lively Muslim city on the coast of what is modern-day Israel.
There's no denying that it was a major port and a major commercial center. Both commercial and military, those are the 2 points. You can't just look at it in a military sense.
Acre is also the gateway to a most sacred place. It is called the Holy Land. At its core is Jerusalem, a city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But violence has plagued this region for centuries.
Many Muslims, particularly in the Middle East, see the creation and the manner of the creation of Israel as an extension of the Crusades themselves. That is, the arrival and the presence of Westerners.
Beginning almost 1,000 years ago, a series of wars transformed this center of faith into an unholy battlefield. Today, archaeologists probe the moment in time when the cycle of fighting began.
I'd say it's about 3 times that.
In England, scientists research the role of military technology.
The idea that the Western Europeans came in with some kind of superior military technology, and that's why the First Crusade was able to win, I think is complete baloney.
Historians piece together the personality clash between England's King Richard I, called Richard the Lionheart for his courage, and the Muslim hero Saladin.
Saladin is a magnificent figure because of the generosity of his character and the generosity of his spirit.
Richard arrives as a brawling, drunken football hooligan, and by the end of his tour to the Middle East, he's a changed man.
What forces drove these men? What motives sparked and fueled 2 centuries of war?
All right, so here's your standard textbook definition for what the Crusades are. It's a series of wars. The numbers vary based on historians or accounts. But we do know it's basically initiated by Western European Christians, primarily directed by the Pope out of Rome, to recapture the Holy Land from Muslims. Right, and so starting in the kind of the tail end of the 7th century, under Omar, the second caliph, the Holy Land came under control of Islamic, the Orthodox Caliphate. Do you guys, what city in particular is at the center of this in the Holy Land? City that's probably the most hotly contested piece of real estate in world history. Jerusalem, right? Okay, so Jerusalem obviously is important to Jews. Obviously, it's the city of David, right? First, it kind of represents David in the capital. Important to Christians because of the crucifixion of Jesus, the Temple Mount, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all the sites that are associated with that. And it's important to Muslims because, I don't know, if you looked up from your phone, you saw there was that golden dome thing. That's called the Dome of the Rock. That's the spot where Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven on a white horse to see the glories of heaven. Right? They had that rock basically encased in this kind of golden dome. All right. So the Crusades. So like when you use the word crusade, like in the West and stuff like that, it's generally like kind of like a positive term, right? So like in the 1970s, there was this dude named Ralph Nader. He's still alive. All right. Ran for president like in 2000 and that. Ralph Nader made a name for himself as a consumer advocate. They often refer to him as the crusader for the consumer. Right. The reason why you have seatbelts in your cars is because of Ralph Nader in this book called Unsafe at Any Speed. Right. So usually I kind of mention crusader in that sense. Somebody who's like kind of has a mission, and it's usually for good. However, like in chapter 6, when we were talking about the chapter on Islam, I discussed this concept called jihad. Do you guys remember that? Mm-hmm. What's a jihad? Religious war. It's a holy war, right? And the Quran states that the jihads are justifiable if to protect or kind of promote the faith. And on top of that, if you die in jihad, all right, if you become martyred, you get 72 virgins when you get to heaven, or raisins. It all depends on how the translation is. All right. And so when we here in the West, we hear groups like ISIS say, we want a global jihad. All right, that's associated with violence and bombings and things like that. And people get kind of a little suspect. However, in the Middle East, when Muslims hear the word crusades, it's basically the same. All right. So, like in 2001, when Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, basically orchestrated the 9/11 attacks, right? They orchestrated their operations in Afghanistan, right, with the help of a group called the Taliban. So we invaded, we being the United States, kind of forced the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan, forced Al Qaeda into the caves in that area. And so the president at the time was George W. Bush. You guys remember George W. Bush? Now he's known as a painter. But George W. Bush, his father was president at one point. He went to like Yale and kind of raised and kind of went to like some pretty prestigious private schools. But he was governor of Texas before he became president. So he kind of developed kind of a little bit of twang. Yeah, he kind of talked a little bit like this. It's kind of a way to kind of get on the level of the people, the voters, And so after we basically kind of forced the Taliban out and stuff like that, there was a press conference that he was giving in which people would say, well, what's your goal here? And so, his intentions were good, right? The idea was that he wanted to basically say, we're not here to colonize Afghanistan. We don't want to take over Afghanistan. Plus, Afghanistan has a reputation still to this day as the graveyard of empires, right? Alexander the Great couldn't handle it. The Soviets couldn't handle it. It's a place that's complicated and such, right? So he's basically saying, we're not here as conquerors. We're here as liberators, basically. He's like, and we're on a crusade to bring freedom and democracy to the region. And some people in the Middle East said, hold on, Hillbilly, what did you say? Come again, crusade? All right. He kind of backtracked that a little bit because the context of that word in the Middle East means something different. All right. So one person's jihad is another person's crusade. All right. And so the kind of the origins of this, you can argue, start a little bit before 1096 is the first crusade. In 1071, there was a battle called the Battle of Manzikert. I talked about this in chapter 6. This was a significant battle in which the Seljuk Turks, we talked about the Abbasid Caliphate based out of Baghdad, was the golden age of kind of Islamic culture. Around the late part of the 10th century, we start to see these kind of like localized, if you will, like kind of caliphates emerge that broke off of the Abbasid Caliphate that still recognized the Abbasid Caliphate for the religious legitimacy, but they were kind of dictating their own political and military kind of endeavors. So one group was the Celtics, who had initially kind of migrated to Abbasid territory, converted to Islam, became staunch Sunnis. They were the ones who were controlling the Holy Land at the time of the start of the Crusades. All right. There was another group that started to emerge out of Egypt that talked about called the Fatimids. All right. They started to encroach upon Seljuk territory. Both of them Muslim. However, the Seljuks are Sunnis, and the Fatimids are the other branch that tend to be odds with each other. What's that? There's Sunnis and Shiites. Okay. All right. So 1071, the Seljuks defeated the Ottomans at the Battle of Manzikert. They captured the Byzantine Empire. I showed you kind of a picture of that when Alp Arslan, who was the Seljuk Sultan, he had his foot on the neck of the Byzantine Emperor. I don't know if you remember that. Basically doing two things. If you have your foot on somebody's neck, you're pretty much as the more powerful person. And then also remember in the Islamic world, you show somebody the soles of his shoes, what is that kind of equivalent to? I just basically double-barreled flipped you guys off. You're in the Islamic world. All right. So that was that picture there. What ends up happening is about 10 years later, the Byzantine emperor at the time writes a letter to the Pope saying, "Hey, I might need a little bit of help because we lost all of Asia Minor here. The Byzantine Empire is really, really shrinking. All right, and so might need a little bit of help here. All right. So what ends up happening? The Pope at that time, who's Pope Urban II, decides, you know what, this is a good opportunity here. All right, so he's responsible for calling the First Crusade. Now, also keep in mind, the term crusade was not used at the time. All right, this is coined a little bit later by French historians. The more common thing would be to take up the cross. That was the more common way to do it. And also the idea of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage to kind of holy sites and stuff like that was real important also for Christians. And so this was an extension of pilgrimage where you just kind of kill people on occasion. All right, so Pope Urban II calls for a meeting called the Council of Claremont of religious clerics and also nobles and stuff, and basically says that there are barbarians, the Saracens, which was a catch-all term for all Muslims. Saracens was actually a term for a specific tribe or clan that was mainly in Syria and Lebanon, that area. They have basically desecrated the kind of holy sites that are associated with Jesus and such. The deal is that at this time, by this time this was called the Council of Claremont, Muslims have been controlling Jerusalem for about 300 years. So it really wasn't pressing up to this point. In reality, what Pope Urban thought was this was a good opportunity. It was an opportunity for him to basically reunify the two churches. If they basically take the Holy Land, basically we got the reunification of the churches with whom at the helm.
Himself?
Yes, boom, himself. All right, great. So basically sidetrack the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Another one we were talking about how in feudalism, think about knights, right? We have this image of knights in shining armor and like holding doors open for ladies and stuff like that. At this point, knights are basically thugs, all right? And so there's a lot of people just basically kind of killing each other and stuff like these. Knights would be kind of let thrust upon like kind of unsuspecting kind of people and stuff. So this was a way to kind of harness some of their kind of unbridled violent nature and their testosterone. And the idea is if you go here on taking up the cross and the pilgrimage and you end up killing Saracens and Muslims, then that's your penance. All right. Before that, if you killed like another Christian, you had to do like these penance that took you out of society for a little bit. All right. So there was political motives as well on his part here with this. So he cloaks the justification for religion and taking back the holy sites. But in reality, he's got some other stuff kind of going on the side, and that kind of like represents the Crusades as a whole to a certain extent. So there's Pope Urban II. Apparently, he had an issue with male pattern baldness. This is the famous painting of the Council of Claremont with him kind of calling in this meeting. I've read other historians that claim that actually the meeting didn't take place in the cathedral there, that it was so large it took outside of the courtyard. But I've read both. So again, let's say it's somewhat questionable. All right. However, his goal was to get like kings, like Henry II and all these people that kind of join in. The kings were just like, nah, we're not going to have a part of this. All right. Again, that was all based on the whole power scale thing between popes and kings. What ends up happening, the people that do take are these mid-level kind of nobles from from France and Germany, like Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon and stuff. Now, before they were able to generate their military, a number of peasants actually kind of got inspired to go this. And there's a whole bunch of these people that the Pope was like, no, you not do what I have in mind. They made it to Turkey. No, they just made it outside the gates of Constantinople, and they were basically kind of turned away. But this group here all coalesced in Constantinople. The emperor wasn't ready for them. Right? They had to basically stay outside the gates for about a week there before he can kind of get accommodations ready for them. Basically making sure they're not going to sack and pillage the city. You'll see on the way there's various routes, a lot of Jewish communities were attacked in the process. They were these kind of guys who were kind of caught up in religious fever. They were kind of pre-gaming, if you will. Right? When they make it into Greece, there's a number of Eastern Orthodox Christians who were killed as well. All right, so they're kind of like practicing as they go along before they can get to Muslims. The First Crusade is really the only truly successful one. All right, the First Crusade, Jerusalem is captured from the Turks. They're split with the Ottomans. All right, a lot of violence though occurs. There's a number of stories, based on even Christian kind of chroniclers on the mass murder of women and children. The numbers are kind of hard to really kind of mix, but the stories of blood running through the streets seems to be kind of like pop up in various kind of accounts. What it does create is these kind of what they call crusader states that start to emerge. These kind of Western Christian military kind of states where basically you're taking European feudalism and just basically planting it into the Middle East. All right, you have the concepts of feudalism within there. You also still to this day, you have remnants of these kind of French style castles in Jordan or Syria and that look a little bit out of place. So this, like I said, this one does kind of complete the goal that it ultimately had set out there. All right, and so this is kind of the illustration of the siege of Jerusalem. These are the various crusader states, like Tripoli, Odessa. The big one is the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. This was primarily made up of French and Norman nobility, if you will, based out of the capital of Jerusalem. And so what also occurs here is the establishment of these monastic kind of military orders. All right. Probably the most famous one that's associated with the Crusades are the Knights of the Temple, or the Knights Templar. All right. These were the ones who primarily were from France, but you had some from England as well. Initially they were kind of protect, they were escort kind of pilgrims coming from Europe to go see the kind of religious sites, right? Later, and they're referred to as the Knights of the Temple or the Templar, because their base of operation was in Jerusalem at the former Solomon's Temple, right, where the Wailing Wall is. With that, there's some stories that they may have had things like the true cross, which Jesus was crucified on, and the Holy Grail. All right, so there's some, and that they may have had something on the church, because the church gave them a exemption. At the time, the idea is that no Christian could make money off of money, like what they call usury. So that's why a lot of Jewish communities were given bankers in there. All right, the Templars were given that exemption. All right, and the Templars became very, very wealthy. They became some of the large landowners in France. So later we're talking about a guy named Philip IV, who's the king of France. He had them disbanded. Because he thought of them as a threat, and I think he owed them some money. All right, so he had the Pope basically order their dissolution on Friday the 13th. That's why Friday the 13th is an unlucky day. And then later, there's some Templars that may have escaped to Scotland, and then with the whole Oak Island thing, the Templars are the kind of the precursor to the Masons. So there's a lot of kind of mystery that's kind of revolves around them. They're very noticeable in the Middle East because they were the ones who wore white cloaks with red crosses. All right. Another group are the Teutonic Knights. Whenever you hear the word Teutonic, that means German. So these are the ones that primarily came from what is essentially the Holy Roman Empire. All right. Their main base of operation was Acre. Acre was the entry point into the Holy Land for Christian pilgrims. That was the port city into the door. So later, the Teutonic Knights, I talked about them in Russia. They were the ones who invaded Russia during the time of Alexander Nevsky. And so they were defeated on there was a battle on a frozen lake called the Battle of the Ice there. So after the Crusades, their base of operation moves to Eastern Europe. They were noticeable. Usually they had white cloaks with black crosses on them. And then the third one are the Knights Hospitaller. You see the word hospital in there. All right. They were initially kind of setting up infirmaries, kind of charity kind of houses for people who were kind of poor that were going on these pilgrimages and such. All right. After the Second Crusade, which the Second Crusade is technically not a crusade, but after the Second Crusade, they kind of become more along the lines of the Templars and the Teutonic Knights. After the Crusades, their base of operations is in the island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean and the Greek island of Rhodes. All right. And so after the Templars were disbanded, some of the Hospitallers kind of acquired some of the wealth and land of the Templars. This is the kind of, they're usually portrayed in black or kind of dark brownish cloaks with white crosses there. All right. Now, like I said, the Second Crusade is generally when the Muslims retake Jerusalem, right, the Holy Land. This occurs in 1187. So we got a little bit of under 100 years where we have the Crusader states that are kind of dominating kind of the Levant area in the Middle East. In chapter 6, I talked about a dynasty that defeated the Fatimids in Egypt called the Ayyubids. They were established by this guy, Saladin. Saladin is like Kurdish descent. He was actually born into Crete, which is the same city later Saddam Hussein's going to be born into. All right. Saladin takes over Jerusalem, basically kind of returns it back to kind of the Muslim city that it was before the First Crusade. Saladin generally has between his adversaries and kind of allies, usually has a pretty positive PR. Also, too, with Saladin, the word assassin, you guys know what assassin means? All right. In the Middle East, there was a group where the word comes from. Assassin in Arabic comes from the word meaning hashish smokers. And so there was a group of within a kind of Islamic, I think with the Fatimids, that were they would smoke hash and then they would try to kill people. That's when they tried to kill Saladin. They didn't succeed. All right. But he had a pretty decent relationship with one of the kings of Jerusalem. All right, in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, he's one of the main characters there. All right, and so this is his painting, his portrait painting that's in the Uffizi in Florence, Italy. There. All right. So what ends up happening is after word gets back to Europe that Jerusalem has fallen, the Holy Land has fallen. The Pope at the time, Pope Gregory VIII, like Pope Urban, initiates the what's called the Third Crusade, which is also referred to as the King's Crusade. This is probably the more famous one because the people that were involved that led this were the three main kings of the three states of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. All right. So this is one where kind of Gregory's got a little bit of cachet, right? He's as Pope, he's able to get the kind of the top kind of like the top leaders of these countries, not just these mid-level nobles, all right, if you will. So here's Gregory's cameo. Now the top three, the big three here. Richard I, aka Richard the Lionheart, he's the King of England, right? He's the one, his father's Henry II, who I talked about last week. His brother who succeeds him is John I, the guy who lost Normandy and was kind of forced to sign the Magna Carta, right? Then Philip II, aka Philip Augustus, he's the King of France. He's the guy I talked about last week his reign marked the first time the King of France was actually more powerful than his nobles. And then the third one is Frederick I, aka Barbarossa, Redbeard. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, he doesn't make it to the Holy Land. I was telling you guys last week, he ends up drowning in a river in Turkey. And that's where that whole legend is. Maybe he's not really dead. Maybe he lives in a cave with a little kid that they basically go out to make sure that these ravens are flying around this mountain. When they don't fly around this mountain, then he comes back to return. I don't know. It seems all very kind of strange. All right. But Richard and Philip initially make it to the Middle East. All right. So, and this is, like I said, the Pope's got a little bit of cachet here. All right. You guys got this? I'm going to try to keep it moving. Make sure I'm not moving too fast, though. All right. So there's Richard. All right. There's Philip, and there's Frederick. All right. Now, what ends up happening here is there's a little bit of success in the beginning. The combined forces of Richard and Philip recapture Acre, the entry point into the Holy Land. All right. However, soon after they recapture it, Philip's got to split. He's got to go back to France. He claims he's not feeling well. All right, you got to keep in mind people can get sick kind of easy. And it's like, so he's got to go back. In reality, he goes back to France to basically put down a rebellion of some nobles. All right, that leaves Richard just to basically take on Saladin in Jerusalem in that area around there. So for about 3 years, there's a stalemate. There's atrocities on both sides from many accounts here. And then at one point, the two kind of develop a rapport. They kind of start to correspond with one another. At one point, Richard gets sick. He has a fever. And back then, they didn't have any Tylenol. So fevers can really get you sick. So the story was, could kill him. The story was that Saladin sent his physician to Richard. And the medical science in the Middle East was a little bit better than Europe. Matter of fact, there's a lot of there's a number of primary sources which talk about Muslims and when they first meet French knights and stuff like that, how gross they are. There's a lot their scent and their hygiene. Europeans at this time are kind of gross. All right. One of the things that Saladin gives Richard is fruit juice, vitamin C. All right. And so the Europeans benefit from some of this interaction. They bring back some things like fruits and some vegetables and even some spices and stuff like that. And on top of that, the story was how this is, whether it's true or not, is all debatable, is that he had ice from a mountain that was brought down in this chest. And that kind of helped him get a little bit better. And still, if you ever get an opportunity to go to Europe and we're all done with this kind of stuff, you will find that still Europeans aren't a big fan of cold drinks. Every time I've been to Europe, it's always if you want to get a soda, it's drinking it like it was just right out of the 12-pack. I don't know what it is with not all Europeans, but a lot of Europeans just ice to them is just that's one of the things they make fun of Americans because we like a lot of ice. I don't know how they quench their thirst actually in Europe. They must be perpetually thirsty. But either way, I digress. All right. Richard showed his thank you to Saladin by actually offering one of his sister's hands in marriage. Right. Of course, without actually conferring with her about this. So she ends up kind of turning that down. They do come to an agreement. This agreement is that Muslims keep Jerusalem, Christians keep Acre. All right, and the city is open, and the Holy Land is open to Christian pilgrims. They can go to visit all the sites, the Calvary Mount, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is an important site. Site we believe that Jesus kind of was resurrected there. Saladin, it was during this time that Saladin basically said that there would be one family. This one family gave the keys to it. They will make sure that the church is open to Christian pilgrims. Still to this day, it's the same family that every morning opens up the doors to that church. The same keys from the 12th century. All right, so that's kind of interesting and kind of unique. Unfortunately, though, for Richard, is that he thinks he does a good job. He heads back to Europe. The Pope didn't get conferred on this, and he's like, nope. Anybody who captures Richard, there's a bounty on him. You'll get some money. So Richard was captured in Europe. I believe it was in France. The English had to essentially kind of ransom him off, and then he's going to Normandy before he heads back to England. Notices that a French noble has taken one of his castles while he was gone. It's so he can't let that stand, so he tries to retake that. In the process, before the battle even occurred, there was a story where there was a kid that was 15 years old or something like that, who was on guard, and while Richard was kind of walking around just kind of observing his castle, the kid shot him in the leg. Richard didn't think anything of it, and basically took the arrow and tried to pull it out and broke it off in his leg. Well, he got septic and ended up dying from that. So he never makes it back to England. So for that good deed, the Pope has him put a bounty on his head, and he ends up getting shot in the leg and dies. All right.
What's their family name that opens their church?
I can't remember, but it's the same family. They say you can look that up. Yeah, it's the same.
What's the church name?
Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Yeah. So this is from a illustration from probably a French chronicler because it's the city of Acre, the keys being turned over to Philip. So obviously he's the one, but Richard does most of the fighting. Now fast forward to the Fourth Crusade. This does a lot of damage. All right, the Fourth Crusade. The idea was that instead of going through the traditional way through Constantinople, why don't we basically invade first Egypt, the soft underbelly, all right, and then work our way up. However, the Venetians get involved. All right, the Venetians were initially going to just transport crusaders over. A lot of Italian city-states benefited from the the movement of pilgrims and the movement of goods back from the Middle East. So at that time, the Doge, the head of the city of Venice, gets a letter from the deposed Byzantine Emperor Alexios IV, who basically says, "Hey, my brother usurped. If you help me get back on the throne, there'll be a reward for you. It'll be really nice." All right. So instead of going to Egypt, they end up going to Constantinople. They're going to collect this reward. So they end up putting Alexios IV on the throne. However, he doesn't have the money to pay them. All right, and so what ends up happening is that they siege the city, and basically for 57 years we have basically Venetians running the capital of the Byzantine Empire. All right, it does quite a bit of damage. Any hope of connecting the two churches is gone at this point. So there's an image here of the Fourth Crusade. All right, Fifth Crusade. This is a two-front invasion. The idea was to go to the same thing, Jerusalem via Egypt, and they don't make it. They end up basically staying in Egypt. The only thing that they take is a port city, which is somewhat financially beneficial, called Damascus. They tried to sack Cairo. That's not going to work. The Ayyubids are still in power here. All right. So the Fifth Crusade, like the Fourth Crusade, doesn't really get to the Holy Land. All right. This is a fading of that. The Sixth Crusade, sometimes it's referred to as the Seventh Crusade. There's a little bit of confusion in some of the numbers. I have it as the sixth, sometimes the seventh, but whatever. Sixth Crusade is led by Frederick II, all right, who is the Holy Roman Emperor as well as the King of Sicily. Now, this crusade is kind of interesting, is that actually it does make it to Jerusalem, and there's a lot of negotiations done. All right, matter of fact, Frederick negotiates with the Ayyubids to basically turn over Jerusalem for the Christians, and then the next 10 years will be the Muslims. All right, again, Frederick's like, hey, look what I did. Pope's like, I wasn't informed on this, so he hasn't tried to be excommunicated, and that's where we got some, like, there's some conflict with the Holy Roman Empire. The Seventh or Eighth Crusade, that's where St. Louis is involved. He's the main one. Never makes it to the Holy Land, ends up stopping off in North Africa, where he dies in Tunisia. That's why, like, if you look at the horse he's sitting on at Art Hill, it's got one leg up. He's kind of fast-tracked into sainthood. All right. This is a French illustration of the attack. The Muslims are portrayed as almost like European knights. The last of the Crusades, and again, the Crusades and numbers kind of vary and stuff like that, but eventually, when the popes are called Crusades, they would almost be disregarded at a certain point. There was Crusades against other Christians, so on and so forth. The end of the Crusades is generally viewed as 1291. That's when Acre falls to the Muslims. Now, there's some interest. There's one kind of between the Third and Fourth Crusade called the Children's Crusade, which was led by two separate kind of groups. One from France, led by an 8-year-old. One from Germany, led by a 12-year-old. All right. What ends up happening is the idea is that they believe that the Crusaders weren't pure of heart. Both the 8 and 12-year-old died before they get there. Some of the ones from France made it, have an audience with the Pope. The Pope says, go home, this is not your fight. Some Venetian and some Italian merchants say, no, we'll take you to the Holy Land. So they get him on the boat. Instead of going to the Holy Land, they end up taking him to North Africa and sending him into slavery. All right, last slide here. All right, what are some of the results of the Crusades? One, decline in papal prestige. All right, the Pope, after they start calling for more Crusades, and less people go, they lose a little bit of power. Decline in power nobles, particularly those who were kind of mid-level nobles, like you benefited from the First Crusade, that starts to decline a little bit when you see the influx of kings and stuff like that. Obviously, Byzantine power declines. Byzantine Empire falls apart in 1453. The Fourth Crusade does a lot of damage. Increase in religious intolerance, which is still probably around today, between Muslims, obviously, and Christians, but also between Christians and Jews. And then the one positive thing, an increase in trade. Europeans are going to get a lot of things like spices, exotic goods. The wealth that's going to be created in Italy from transporting pilgrims and goods back and forth is going to spark the Renaissance. All right, sorry, I got a little long-winded. What time we get it out of here? A minute? I did that really fast. It was like auctioneer fast. All right, so review tomorrow, test on Friday.